record here. All right, I'd like to welcome everybody to our series of livestock judging. This is with us tonight is Matthew Cheney, the OSU, I'll call you the main campus for main campus coach. I don't know how you describe yourself. He's on main campus with in Columbus, and he's going to go over goats, Goat 101 with us tonight. So I'm going to turn it over to you. Myself, I'm Becky Barker, and I'm in Morrow County. I'm the 4-H educator, and a couple others are on here. Kayla, you want to introduce yourself?
I'm Kayla Nyheiser. I'm the 4-H educator in Hocking County, and I think Mackenzie's on here too.
Yeah, Mackenzie's on here, and for sure. Go ahead, Mackenzie.
Yeah, sorry. So my name's Mackenzie Dorr. I am, I guess, program coordinator, whatever you want to call it, on main campus for the Ohio 4-H Animal Science program. So I help run like the state contest, and all the good things at State Fair.
Okay. And for sure, this is being recorded, and we will share it on our 4-H site, the Ohio 4-H site, and with the animal science site as well. So let Matthew, you take over.
Perfect. So before we kind of jump in, I start to share my screen there. So obviously this is the fourth of the 4 species that we're going to cover. I believe next month is it EPDs, or do we start on reasons?
We do. We go into EPDs and any kind of questions, anything along those extra things.
Okay, perfect. So like I was saying, they're fourth of 4 of the species. So really, I think maybe if you've been tuning in from the first kind of session where Seth's kind of opened up the door about some beef cattle evaluation to swine to sheep last month and now goats. A lot of the things we talk about, a lot of the priorities are going to be very similar in terms of the breakdown and the way we read those livestock, whether it's breeding or market. It's going to be maybe identical in certain species, and they might deviate a little bit between species at times. But in terms of understanding the basics and the priorities, a lot of that's going to be identical. So we're going to actually kind of take a little bit of a different approach to that today. And instead of opening up with a PowerPoint slide, instead of starting to kind of go over those priorities again, we each talk about, whether this is your first time tuning in, or if you're going to be watching the Zoom recording here tomorrow per se. We're going to kind of take a different approach, and by doing so, we're going to open up with a class of 4 goats, and we're going to kind of just walk through that as a group. So you get a little bit of my kind of expert opinion in terms of what's the first things I notice. How do I start to prioritize? How do I start to align that class in terms of that breakdown? Because if you're able to stick to the priorities in that first minute, in that first 5 minutes of that class, to the very last minute when time is called, you'll be able to save yourself from maybe a simple bust or kind of a big pair switch, and kind of can save yourself the most amount of points possible, because at the end of the day, the low score wins. So the fewer amount of points you can drop on those simple classes by doing the easy things and by evaluating them and prioritizing right, can ultimately save you there in the end, can kind of allow you to maybe see that podium top 10 performance at least once or twice. So in doing so, we'll just kind of break down a class of goats and kind of proceed from there. So let's see. Perfect. So for all those that you guys can see my screen, this is a class of goats that we would have had the chance to judge last year at the American Royal. So as a kid, your first time is kind of walking up to that class, and you're going to see not the goats on a side view, but in these contests, you're going to see these goats typically on that rear view kind of look. So when it comes to, starting to prioritize, starting to evaluate, like in those other species we talked about, we're going to look for muscle. we're going to look for something in the, in regards to body shape, body dimension. We're going to look for some structural attributes. So skeletal correctness is going to be key. And then we're going to, see how all three of those things kind of correlate together and work hand in hand, and allow animals to balance. So kind of their silhouette and the way they pattern from the side is going to be important as well. So kind of that first priority that we talked about, muscle. So where do we look for muscle? Of course, one here in the rear view, it's going to be that first view we get when we walk up to that class. So instantly I'm thinking, okay, what do these goats look like in terms of kind of a base width standpoint? This one goat right here, that's a pretty wide base goat. The two goats got, plenty of kind of just dimension and kind of width there to the base of his skeleton. Maybe the three goat starts to look like he's a little bit narrower, comparatively from the others. But all these goats look like they got enough muscle from a base width, kind of a lower skeleton standpoint. Along with that, we're going to kind of follow them up there from the surface, and we're going to see, if those animals progressively, still have plenty of width, plenty of just dimension there to them. Start on that one goat. That one goat's pretty big and broad and wide in his upper hip. And because of that, that goat looks plenty square there from behind. The two goat looks like he's got some width up here. And granted, we're not talking anything in terms of like their lower leg shape, their stifle shape, their twists or anything just yet. We're just kind of talking their upper hip. Three goat looks like he's, acceptable. Four looks like he's probably, a skosh narrower there, maybe comparatively to one or two. From a lower leg shape, kind of a outward flare there, in terms of one's kind of twists, depth of twist, some stifle shape, some lower leg or lower glute muscle. That one goat looks extremely good. He's got kind of a nice turn there to his outer stifle. The goat's got a nice bulge there to his lower leg shape. In terms of his depth of twist, he's plenty good in terms of that standpoint. This one goat or this two goat right here maybe is a little bit flatter in terms of that one's kind of the turn out of that one's upper hip. That goat's probably not the same kind of just turn there in terms of his lower leg, like this one goat. And right there, kind of that color pattern change is a very good spot to tell. So he maybe flattens a little bit more in his lower leg. This three goat looks like, that goat's got some good lower leg shape, but we already said he's a little bit narrower up here, so he kind of flattens out a little bit more in his upper hip. This four goat, is not bad. He's just a little bit probably plainer, a little bit shallower twisted in terms of his muscle shape. So like when I walk up to that class and I got that first minute to look at those goats from behind, I'm already thinking, okay, that one goat's pretty, plenty stout, plenty powerful. He's very square from hock down. That two goat's got plenty of muscle. He's got a good kind of, shape there to his lower leg. The three goat's a little bit narrower pin, but he's still got some base width there underneath of him. He does hock in a little bit. And that one probably pound for pound's not, I know for a fact, not as stout as one. He's, probably not necessarily as just kind of shapely in terms of his lower leg shape as two potentially. So maybe one and two might start to surface. This four goat, certainly a little bit flatter in terms of his lower leg shape. So it might boil down into a bottom pair potentially if I'm just thinking about it right now from a muscle standpoint. But one's a pretty nice goat, two's a nice goat, three and four might kind of start to break into a pair. So that's the first view I'm looking at on those goats. So like any smart person would, you start to walk around kind of those goats there in the rack. And so you're going to start to walk around, and that's when you start to get hit with that side view. So you just kind of just glance over them from a side view standpoint. And on that side view, I'm going to think a little bit about some structural attributes. What do these goats look like? They're in the stanchion. They're in this kind of there in the stand. So I'm like, one, balance is extremely nice. He's good in terms of his top line, a nice shape there to his lower leg, a good set to his hock. He's probably a little bit forward there in terms of his knee. As you see how he kind of, reads a little bit more over in his knee. That's probably one thing structurally, but like that goat, without the exception of his knee right there, that goat, paints a pretty nice picture, pretty good look. The two goats, dead level there in terms of his top line, still got plenty of kind of just, set there to his hock and in terms of his foot. Probably not necessarily as good in his neck set as one, but that's kind of very minuscule in terms of the big picture of things. The three go, I'm like, okay, this one's, deviates quite a bit right there behind his shoulder. That one's spine works up. He's real steep out of his hip. He kind of gets a little bit straighter there in terms of his hind leg posture. Structurally, that goes just kind of a little iffy. He's not as good as these two right here, 1 and 2. I'm also thinking 4, like, okay, that goat, starts to wash out a little bit right there behind his shoulder, behind his scapula. Read him out of his hip. He's all right. He's adequate there. But like how we saw there in that rear view, we thought that goat kind of flattens a little bit in terms of his lower leg shape. Well, from this standpoint, absolutely 100%. We realized that what we saw from behind kind of matches there from the side. So that's just kind of an average structured goat. We got 2 nice structured goats there in 1 and 2. Looks like it's going to shape out to be more of a bottom pair than we, like we had anticipated there just from that rear view. Well, as you're walking around the goats, you're going to get to a little bit of that chest view as well. Chest view standpoint, is also another great indicator, like we talked about those last kind of 3 sessions in terms of some muscularity. So you want a big opened up chest. You want, like Seth might have talked about there on hogs, kind of a really bold bladed barrel, as where his blade sits a little bit on the outside of his body wall, is going to have naturally more muscle than that of a kind of a narrow chested, flat bladed, pig. The same thing, same concept applies to that of the goats. Same thing, it's very similar to that of sheep as well. We look at these 2 goats right here, 1 and 2, we're like, kind of big chested. They got plenty of width right here in terms of kind of their art, like kind of from armpit to armpit. That's a kind of a square chested, square fronted one that's kind of big in terms of his chest and big in terms of his blade. His forearm stout forearm. 4's actually got a very stout forearm there to him. I mean, his chest view looks very nice. If I just see the chest view on that goat, I'm thinking, okay, he's already better than 3. 3 right here is kind of a very plain chested one. He's not that wide right here, but right there in terms of his heart, his knee kind of works in on him a little bit more. You see how he's just not necessarily real square about his knee like that of 1 or 2. And on top of that, that goat just looks a good bit frailer in terms of his forearm. And forearm is a very good indicator of muscle. So like to kind of put this in perspective for you guys. So a bodybuilder is going to have, naturally, kind of big forearms if they're going to be, if they've been working out, if they've been in the gym quite a bit. Now, if we were to able to see, maybe a guy that only ever trains his bicep and his forearm is very small and he's got, kind of like chicken arms, but a big kind of baseball shaped bicep, we think that was very strange, right? So similar to that of goats, if we had a very small forearm, 9 times out of 10, I'm also going to think he's, doesn't have much muscle to him. So like it all should fit and it all should correlate. So the cool thing about livestock, regardless of the species, so even, how we think about like kind of humans in terms of bodybuilding, even track and performance, things like that, a lot of the same concepts can be kind of a little bit similar. And that's why we, exercise these goats to the same kind of regimens we do on a lot of kind of, a lot of kind of weight training, concepts as well. So to kind of get back to the goats, in terms of that chest view, I'm thinking 3 is a frail forearmed, bad kneed one. That's just very average chested, probably a last place goat. 1 and 2 look like they're still head and shoulders above, 4. 4's chest view isn't actually that bad. Well, now that I've got all 3 views of that goat, it's time to go ahead and go in for a close inspection or go into handle. Well, now in that close inspection or kind of handle moment, we get this overhead view. So, I hope you guys kind of see where I'm coming from on this, kind of walking through a little bit in terms of the evaluation side of it. But from a muscularity standpoint, this is a huge view that we can kind of start to break down, start to look at. So if you're following along, we're already saying 1 and 2 are our top pair goats. 3 and 4 are going to be in the bottom pair. And after that, what we saw there on that chest view, 3's probably going to go last. So probably 4 is going to slide in third. Well, now is a great way to kind of confirm what we just thought, and kind of evaluate it from a quick, a 3 view standpoint. So in terms of just body shape, in terms of kind of some back, rack, and loin standpoint, one looks like he's kind of a big square rack to go that's got plenty of just dimension there down his top. In terms of a body shape standpoint, he doesn't have like a hay belly like you might see there at a county fair. But that goat's very round and athletic in terms of his body shape. And we'll kind of talk a little bit more about that kind of the body discussion when we go back to that rear view, once we get done with this priority. But that's a good body shape, good body goat. In body shape, like Seth would have probably preached home about there on the hogs, you want kind of like an egg shape, or like a heart shape, I mean, there on the hog side of things, versus that of maybe like an A-frame shape. And it's all muscularity and kind of their handle quality is all going to be, based upon their rib shape. So we want a nice bold shape, or kind of a round shape. This 3 goat kind of pinches quite a bit right there in terms of his forerib. 2 even actually pinches a good bit there in terms of his forerib as well. So that's, starts to maybe, reduce the same kind of muscle kind of that muscle shape, that muscle difference between a few of those. But 1's good there, 2 pinches a little bit here. So if I had to guess, he's probably not as big over his rack and loin as maybe that 1 goat because of his body shape. The 3 goat's a little bit flatter here in terms of his mid rib. He starts to kind of narrow and taper a little bit as you kind of work your way back. That goat's probably just very average in terms of his muscle. If I had to imagine, the way he pinches right here in terms of his hip loin junction, I bet he's kind of a skinny loin, a bad kind of a hip loin goat there. That 4 goats, decent. Like we saw his chest view in terms of his width, and then he really breaks quite a bit right here in terms of his forerib. That's probably the worst forerib goat of the group. But that goat actually, from his chest back to his upper hip, that goat looks like he's still got plenty of width as you work your way back in comparison to this 3 goat. So I'm like, for sure, 4's got more muscle than that of 3. So that's a little bit in terms of that top view discussion between those. So from a muscularity standpoint, I'm going to say, okay, if I had to place the class off of muscle, I'm thinking 1, 2, 4, 3. But at the same time, there's other priorities that we need to think about, right? So, and if there's any questions, feel free to interject whenever we can address them as we go through. So don't be afraid to, raise a hand or ask. So along with muscle, there's also structure, and structure is kind of a big thing as well. And I don't necessarily think they walk the goats in this video, and depending on the contest, you might get a chance to walk the goats. But structurally, we talked a lot about skeletal angles and the way skeletons and, the way an animal's angles and kind of bones are just naturally organized. They're on, that particular animal is going to tell a lot about it in terms of their movement. Because this goat's so good and strong right here behind his shoulder, and so kind of hard about his top line, I guarantee that goat's top line stays in him as he goes. He's got a nice set there to his hock. His feet go in the right direction. I know we tweaked him in terms of his knee, but I think that goat, certainly stays together as he's pulled the lead. I think the same thing can be said about this 2 goat, because shoulder angle, he's good. His top line's dead level. And, in terms of that one's kind of hip length, in terms of that one's kind of stifle joint and the way he goes, in terms of his hock set, is very appropriate as well. So I think that goat starts to, piece together as well there on the move. I did say something about his shoulder angle in terms of the difference between kind of 2 and 1, but kind of 1's shoulder angle. He's not only a little bit longer necked, but it kind of comes out a little higher. This goat looks like it comes out a little lower. That's why he's kind of struggling a little bit more in terms of that one's kind of muzzle being so high in the air. Foregoat looks decent there up front. Top line, looks all right. Hind leg set looks like he's, his stifle joint, which is right here in terms of his hock set, gets a little outside of him. My guess is that goat on the move starts to kind of get a little bit loose and needs to probably come in a little bit there from behind. That 3-go looks like he's probably going to be a little bit of a mess. I bet his top line just kind of falls out of him because of the way it's naturally propped up there on the stanchion or there on the brace. His hip is real steep. I bet he kind of jabs his rear feet there underneath of him. The reason why I also say he jabs them is because if you look at his ankle, he looks very kind of straight, a little bit too upright there in terms of his ankle, which also makes his hock set look a little bit straighter as well. So structurally, just that kind of quick little breakdown on him, I'm like, 3's not a good structured goat. 4 looks like he might have some issues. 2 looks like he's nice. And 1 looks like he'll be very good. If he could tweak his knee, I think that'd be a really nice structured goat. So from a structure standpoint, it's kind of starting to break down that way in the same pair. And then along with that, in terms of the next priority, from a muscle or not muscle, from a body and rib shape standpoint, how it goes a little bit hand in hand with that of muscle. We already know that, okay, good bodied, pinches quite a bit, a little bit too flat, and just acceptable there in terms of that overhead view, in terms of a roundness, a boldness, or even a fullness of rib standpoint. We also look at them from the side here, and we're like, okay, this goat looks like he's probably a little bit, from his chest to flank progression, looks like that goat kind of wedges very nice. He's a little bit sheepy in terms of his underlying quality, in terms of that balance and progression. This goat, that 1 goat, like how I said, he was very round in terms of his body shape. I mean, just look at maybe even a little bit of the shadowing on this goat, and it looks very dimensional. It looks athletic. It looks like his skin and his hide just naturally kind of wrap on him a whole lot tighter than maybe this goat or this goat. So, skin and even a composition standpoint, that goat's very nice. This goat probably gets a little bit just kind of flatter here. He's real pinched in terms of his forerib and even the way he kind of hooks up right behind his shoulder. This goat from the side looks, like he'd be acceptable. And then unfortunately, you kind of, we also got a 3/4 nice. We also get that overhead view, and you're like, but he pinches really bad right there in terms of his forerib. So that's kind of that overhead view, along with a side portion. And then what I didn't realize we had was a 3/4, and 3/4 can tell a lot. So same, very similar wise in terms of that roundness, in terms of, that one's body shape. That's probably the best view to look on them. We see how this one's really kind of flat right here, right in behind his blade. His blade and shoulder kind of sit on the outside of his body wall, so it only, kind of further, identifies or exaggerates, this kind of tightness or pinch there to his forerib and heart. This goat does pinch and kind of come in a little bit right there behind the scapula a little bit. Like we might have, hinted at there in the very beginning, but just from a body shape standpoint, 1 blows this out of the water. 2 is acceptable. 3 is way too flat. 4, despite being kind of real flat right here behind his shoulder, he still progresses with, some sort of width there to him and his lower body balance as well. I'm still thinking a 1, 2, 4, 3, just off of a rib shape, body quality standpoint. So, and that's just in a quick, looking at each of those views on those goats. So, that first view, when I'm stuck with a rear view on those goats, I'm like, okay, let's see how it goes. 1's nice, 2's good, 3 and 4 are probably bottom pair kind. You look at the chest view. 3 is not good enough. He's 4th. That means 4 is probably going to slide into 3rd. Still between 1 and 2, it's good. Probably a toss up between them. You get in terms of that structure and even that rib shape standpoint, and you're like, okay, I know where it has to go. It's got to go 1, 2 there on top. And you start to kind of work together to find that placing in terms of understanding those priorities. So we're going to let this play through and we're going to start to see how all that kind of comes together, kind of comes to fruition. So like kind of that's that first view you get on them. There's kind of that view from behind. So it kind of starts to tell a little bit of the story there. You can even honestly see one's knee right here from that 3/4 where he starts to kind of get over there. See the chest view on 3, and instantly you're like, okay, that goes 4th. Oh, here they are in the rack, which is honestly probably a good point to stop thinking about it. We see that 4 goats kind of real flat lower leg shape, real flat lower leg shape, and realize, okay, he's never going to be as muscular as that of 1 and 2. We see him here on that kind of that side view, and he still breaks behind his shoulder. He's a little bit straighter up front in terms of his shoulder blade, his knee down as well, in relation to that 2 goat. Okay, 4 goats for sure, 100% third. Still a nice pair between 1 and 2. And then as we get to the end there, we realize 1's simply the better goat in terms of a body shape standpoint, a front end neck set standpoint, with the exception of his knee. And even in terms of that 1's just shape there from behind, he's extremely square and good in terms of his kind of his lower leg, lower glute and lower leg shape. So in terms of that neck set call that I made earlier, this is probably a good view to kind of call on it or kind of see a little bit. That goat just looks a whole lot more relaxed in terms of his front end posture. This goat looks like he's kind of straining quite a bit. He's a little straighter up front here. And him, when he's in a relaxed state, wants to kind of throw him out up front, kind of toe those kind of front feet out. This goat's knee's not good enough, but at the end of the day, if that's the only thing we tweak on him, don't miss the forest for the trees is what I would tell the kids. So that's kind of kind of the breakdown on that class of goats. So I'd end up, officiating this class 1, 2, 4, 3, and that would kind of be the reason why. So are there any questions on that side of it? Yeah, perfect. So now we'll go ahead and roll straight into maybe the breeding doe side of things. And I'm actually going to stop the share here for this now. So on the breeding goat kind of perspective, I know there's a lot of discussion at times between, okay, do we judge them as breeding goats? Do we judge them as weather dams? Kind of what's the reason behind it? What do we do? Where do we start? So in terms of, trying to identify the difference between them, if you were to ask, anyone, whether it's Seth or I, we'd tell you, you judge them the exact same because a good livestock surface regardless of what we call the class. So, we might think a breeding class, we, put a little bit more emphasis on structure. On weather dams, we might put in a little bit more emphasis on muscle. Regardless, we want livestock, they're going to be utilized to produce livestock regardless. So structure is always going to be important. So let's not go ahead and just throw it out the window if it's called, weather dams versus out of breeding does. So kind of take the mindset, of both of those classes and just realize that, okay, from a priority standpoint, like structure's always going to be big. Those goats also got to have muscle nowadays. If they don't have muscle, but they're good structured, they're probably a 3rd place animal. They got to have some sort of body shape to them. They got to have some sort of still female kind of characteristics, so still kind of a maternal look there to them. So maybe don't overemphasize at times on, on a single trait, whether you're going to muscle them out on weather dams, still taking that kind of that consideration, that structure is still very important before you kind of start to throw one, 4th or throw 1 3rd when really they're good in each of those areas, but just not the most impressive, that single one area. So before we kind of jump into kind of a breeding doe or, a breeding doe class, here. Are there any questions there on, the market goats? I hope breaking it down that way kind of makes things a whole lot easier. And if you can kind of follow along those lines of those priorities, we can kind of stay in check and save ourselves from, big cuts across the board. So if there's any questions, feel free to speak up.
Do you ever handle market goats in
Yeah,
any
so
contests?
yeah, so we'll handle market goats at every contest we go to. And in handling those market goats, what I tell my kids, and I think Seth can even agree on this, but never switch more than a pair when you go into handle, because that first impression of what you see is not going to lead you astray. I mean, because you can legitimately see what's going on when you start to handle. You can be fooled by a lot of things, whether it's loin edges and how they're kind of set up. You can be a little bit kind of carried away and a little bit too much on fat and where to prioritize fat and kind of condition on an animal at times. So never really deviate much more than a placing from your initial placing. So like, let's say I had that class of goats place initially 2-1, 4-3, and I go in and handle. I'm like, okay, one looks extremely good. Well, at that point, I'd say, okay, from what I saw earlier, I knew it was a close pair. I handle them now, and it only kind of confirms what I saw initially. I feel confident and comfortable switching that pair. But if you were to say handle them, and you're like, oh, 4 handles really good, I would be really, disappointed if I had a kid come in and say, I started 4 because he handled really good. Well, what you saw for the first 5 minutes prior, and you had him third, it should be not enough to ever get him to, jump to first. So if they were to take a middle pair switch, I would be, still a little bit maybe disappointed, but at least they still kind of stayed within boundaries on that. So good question there. JP, Dennis, what's your question?
So when you're like showing the goats, if this is your first year having a breeder, is it harder than having a market?
So in terms of bracing those goats and kind of showing them, a lot of the same concepts of getting one presented, getting one shown is going to be identical across the board. So you're still going to kind of hold those goats there up there by their head. Get your hands kind of around their lower jaw, kind of right there behind their ears as well, and kind of get into them and brace them. So you're still going to use your leg with all that. Now on the does, in terms of showing off a little bit more of the views, you'll probably still need to get off of those goats a little bit more. Maybe make sure their head and their ears stay a little bit more forward, depending on if that judge is coming around the front. At times you can get off of those goats, show them kind of down, so you're not bracing them the entire time. But when the judge comes in, he'll still handle those goats there in the show ring. If that's your, in terms of that showing aspect of them. So, but in terms of judging now, the does will be loose at all the contests versus the market that will be in the racks.
So can you describe what would a new judge, yeah, that's young, learning, what do they mean to handle them? What does that mean? What are they supposed to be doing? Everybody's doing it. They're like, what am I? I'm just following the crowd.
Yes. So on these goats, when you go in and handle them, and kind of it's going to be very similar to sheep. You're going to run your hands down their top. And honestly, let me go back to kind of that screen sharing mode. So when you get to that overhead view, and let's just go solely here on one. When you get to that overhead view, you're going to go ahead and take your hands, run your, kind of your left hand right over the top of that goat. And right here is going to be that goat's rack. So kind of like the first 2, 3 kind of rib, area. His forerib area is going to be kind of that goat's rack shape. So you're wanting to feel a nice wide square shape. And like Seth was talking about, you want kind of like the top of a heart. You want that muscle to sit up, on both sides of that one's spine. So you got his spine running straight down his top here, and it's kind of a nice kind of shape line there based on the hair. But you want a nice kind of round shape, kind of nice butterfly shape there, similar to your pigs. So real muscle is going to sit up naturally like that. Now on maybe that 4 goat or that 3 goat, they start to flatten a little bit more. So it's going to be a little bit more like this. So it's going to be a little bit smaller in terms of that one's handle. So that's kind of your rack. So you're going to move your hands down from their rack over their loin. So their loin will start there at their last rib and go all the way to their kind of their hip loin junction. So just until you feel like kind of the top of their kind of their hip bone. So from here over is going to be their rack. And you're going to take kind of that same approach as what you were doing on the rack to kind of feel for over their loin. So you still want it wide, you want it square, you want it to kind of sit up real flush and level with their hip loin junction. Because in terms of understanding fullness and squareness of a loin, it certainly starts to, kind of help that a little bit of that discussion. So you're going to handle their rack, work your way down to their loin. I never handle the leg on a goat because you can tell, from the outside which ones have muscle and which ones don't. In terms of a cover and finish standpoint, you're going to look right here. So this is that goat's shoulder blade right here. This is that goat's kind of forerib right here. So you're going to just kind of run your hands over that goat's forerib. And because the animal's fatten front to rear, top to bottom, you're going to start here at the kind of the top and work, or start your way here at the top and work your way down just to see in terms of the evenness of cover. Maybe even at times you can see if an animal's really fat, if they got a bunch of cover still down here. So that's going to be how we can tell the difference there on a little bit, or I guess the basics of handling there on the goat side of things. So when you handle sheep, it's going to be very identical. So.
Okay, thank you.
Perfect. And we'll go ahead and jump in here to this class of does before we kind of wrap up. We got about 20 minutes left, and we'll probably be done with this in probably about another 10. So on the goats, the same thing as we talked about on the weathers. This time we might prioritize a little bit more on structure than what we talked about on muscle. Like on the market side, we talked a lot on muscle and how we were to, kind of keep a strong emphasis on muscle with some, aspects of skeletal correctness, some body shape. We were able to kind of make sure we avoided any sort of big, simple busts or big cuts within that class. Now on the doe side of things, we're going to prioritize structure quite a bit, but we still need these animals to have muscle to them. And granted, muscle is the easiest thing to put into that kind of that first generation in terms of a generational interval standpoint. But we can go ahead and start to prioritize both of those priorities quite a bit. We're going to talk a little bit about body shapes and body depth and how that kind of still plays a large role as well. But just from a structural standpoint, I'm thinking this goat standing here, that 3 goat, is very good in terms of her front end set. Her hind leg looked very nice. This 2 goat right here, she looks, acceptable. But then you get that view of her going away. And I know, compared to the market goats were, still, they stayed in the same place. The goats, you kind of got to wait for your views at times. So granted, we're talking structure right now, but that view of that 2 goat just a few seconds ago, that goat looked like she was plenty narrow and plenty flat. So I remember that as I'm judging this class, I'm like, okay, when I get to muscle, I'm going to start to, take that into consideration. But I'm going to go ahead and let these goats kind of continue to walk around, give me the views I need to see out of each of them. So I'm thinking 3's plenty nice. 1 looks acceptable. 1 looks like, that one's, kind of front end looks very nice. She's still square up front. This 4 goat, I got that view of her right now from the side. She looks a little bit moderate in terms of her size. She gets a little bit kind of just straighter in terms of her shoulder angle. That doe right here as she goes, not only does she kind of run downhill and drop her in her chest, you see that right there? She drops in her chest and kind of runs downhill. But that one out of her hip, she gets plenty straight out of her hock. This goat right here, or let's go back 1 second. This one goat right here looks like she's still very nice in terms of her top line. I actually think that goat's got a better set and flexor to her rear leg than this 4 goat does. So structurally, I'm thinking 3 looks really good. 1, she looks like she's kind of nicely structured. She's acceptable structured. 4 looks like she's probably a little too straight, too moderate at times. And her hind leg gets a little straight as well. Like 1 looks very nice going across there. Top line's dead level, hind leg flexes and, works acceptable. So I'm like, okay, placing this class, I'm probably thinking a quick 3-1, 4-2 from a structural standpoint. But then I realized muscle. Where does muscle kind of fit into the mix? So as I kind of go back here and watch it from the beginning, I'm thinking, okay, remember our chest width, our rear views, our 3/4 views. This 3 goat looks, very nice. Watch her go away from this. She's got some pin width. Her chest views here. Got some chest width there to her. We kind of see catch this 2 goat right now going away from us. Kind of narrow, a little narrower base. That goat looks like she doesn't have much muscle. There's her against the other 3, and she's probably the flattest and narrowest one of that mix. There's 4 right there. She's just acceptable. She is bigger boned and a little bit heavier structured than that of 2. This is kind of the view on 1 going away. That doe looks like she's still got some upper hip width, some little base width there underneath. She's not as kind of big shaped and kind of big fuzzed as that 3 doe, but that doe's still got plenty of shape, plenty of muscle there to her. Now I'm thinking, okay, obviously 4 is heavier muscle than 2. 2 is the narrowest, lightest muscled one of the mix so far. 1's acceptable. She's probably, average structured, average muscled. 3's good muscled. And she's also probably my favorite structurally. So I'm starting to maybe prioritize them a little bit, different than how I had them initially if I was to take structure. So structurally, I'm thinking 3-1, 2-4. Muscle wise, I'm thinking 3-1, 4-2. Does it boil into a bottom pair? I don't know. We'll see. Well, the next part of the equation was body shape, some rib shape, and it's more acceptable to be rounder bodied or bolder bodied than it is to be deeper bodied. So circumference is always greater than kind of linear depth. So the bolder or the rounder an animal is, the more volume of dimension there is. Well, 3 is really good in terms of her body shape. You kind of see her here in terms of her rib shape. She's good in terms of a depth of rib standpoint. So not only is she round bodied, but she's also acceptable in terms of her depth, in terms of her proportion of rib. That 1 goat right here, kind of get a little bit of that overhead view. That goat looks like she's got, some upper rib turn, some, upper body dimension. That goat also has plenty of depth. You study her in terms of kind of that chest to flank relationship. And that goat looks like she's certainly appropriate there. Also, like how we talked about earlier, muscle in relation to rib shape, plays, a very large role. It goes hand in hand with each other. So because she's also the second heaviest muscle, I'm not surprised she's, also, acceptable or good in terms of her body shape. Now, 4 and 2, we talked a little bit about them structurally from a muscle standpoint, but let's talk about them from a rib and a rib shape standpoint. So in terms of watching these goats kind of go away from us, this goat right here, that 4 goat looks like she's got, still a good shape. She's not probably necessarily as bold bodied as 1 or 3, but that goat still looks like she's got some, some sort of roundness there to her. When I stop here at 2, I'm thinking, okay, you want to see these animals progress with width or, some sort of just, extras in terms of some dimension. So you'd like them to start narrower and get, progressively wider as you work back. This goat looks like she does the exact opposite. She just stays kind of flat, relatively narrow. So this goat looks, 2 goat looks like she's plenty flat bodied, especially right there. That was a perfect view of her that the cameraman kind of had for us. So she's flat bodied, also narrow, kind of closed up. This foregoat looks like she's got some, some turn there to her in terms of her lower body shape. She's still good in terms of her depth. Two's good in her depth. Depth of body is certainly going across there, but this goat looks like she's bolder, bigger chested. All right, perfect. At the end of the day, I'm thinking, okay, I still like it 3-1 there on top. I like it 4-2 on bottom. So you see how that prioritizing what we just did starts to kind of stack up that class very nice there for us. So if we were to watch this now kind of play all the way to the end, I think we get a very good picture of what we just kind of broke down. So good look on 3. Very nice go. 1's kind of a good chested, good body, good muscled one. Instantly, I get that shot of 2 going away. I'm like, that's a bottom pair kind of a goat. Let's see what this foregoat looks like. Look at 4. Oh, she's got, a little bit of muscle there from behind. She's better and maybe a little bit better in terms of her upper body shape. That goat's got a little bit more bone, a little bit more feature there underneath of her. Just kind of look at her kind of looking at us. Still acceptable in terms of her chest width standpoint. I think she's got a stouter forearm to her. All right. I like it 4-2 on bottom and, roll with it. So in terms of kind of avoiding those big cuts, staying out of trouble, if you kind of start to prioritize them that way, they can certainly save you there in the end. So really livestock judging, it's not that hard. And I hope it's, you guys, after breaking it down this way, rather than a PowerPoint presentation, things start to kind of become a little bit easier for you. Because after breaking it down that kind of in that direction of things, you can start to realize just how simple things can be. And like all we did between the market goats and the breeding does is we just put a little bit more emphasis on, maybe some structure at times, started to break them down a little bit, but still at the end of the day, the good goats always surface. So if they check the boxes and, more than one area, and they're better in areas than others, they're going to be able to start to navigate themselves out of the mix, maybe towards that first or top pair portion of the class, or even find their way kind of working there towards the bottom. So it's not really that hard. It's not rocket science, but if you can stay disciplined and remember the priorities, you can certainly succeed and always kind of come out there with a low drop in certain classes, or even in the contest. So really that's all I have in terms of market goats and in terms of kind of the breeding does. So feel free to ask questions. If you need to reach out to me, my number's always there on kind of the OSU website. I can even put it in the chat if possible. But my email's cheney.287@osu.edu. So feel free to ever reach out if you need any questions. But hoping that we can have you guys each there for kind of next month there with EPDs and talking about how to break down EPDs. So if there's any questions, feel free to kind of ask away.
That doe class, was it described as just the breeding doe class, not the weather doe? What should they get scared if, like, the differences between the weather does and then a breeding goat class?
So yes, so that class was listed as a breeding doe class. Now the difference between breeding does and weather dams is not going to be any different. Like in certain contests, you might have 2 doe classes, and so you don't have a breeding dose 1 and a breeding dose 2. As contest officials or people putting the contest together, you'll probably just have a weather dams and a breeding dose, just so you don't have to call it the same class and put breeding does 1 and breeding does 2 next to it, so to avoid confusion that way. But really it's you judge them the same, and priorities never deviate unless it's kind of a breeding versus market situation. So, but you'll have market goats and they'll be in a rack, and breeding does will be loose. So really there should be no reason to get kind of confused.
Will we ever see dairy goats?
No, we won't see any dairy goats on the livestock side of things. Now on a dairy, contest, I'm sure, potentially there might be at times, but not on the livestock side. So so
That's why I was just wondering if mammary ever comes in the picture with even in the livestock and in goats at all.
no, and we can just like similar to that of like kind of some yearling heifer classes there on the judging side of things. Like when they call it close inspection, you can kind of walk up and just kind of peek your head underneath and see what their kind of their teat structure and even teat shape and size kind of looks like, and you can talk about it from a reasons perspective. But on the goats, because they're kind of loose and in a pen and not being not haltered, it's very hard. And I would say it's extremely, extremely rare that anyone ever really calls out maybe a teat structure there on does. Um, so I mean, never really ever talk anything mammary related there on the go side. So I guess the only other thing I can think of that we didn't really kind of mention tonight, um, in terms of that breakdown, but in terms of IDs, it's always good to call out IDs. So like that one goat out of that market goat class, that was kind of your painted up, your, let's say you can in essence call them kind of the red goat or the red weather. That two goats kind of a lighter headed, a little bit more traditional colored goat. 3 and 4 were, about it similar. 3 was kind of a blonde headed goat though. There on those two. There's really not much color differences past that. And you can also talk a little bit about ears, in terms of kind of whether they're kind of folded eared, whether they got like an overbite, kind of a parrot mouth goat. So like in most judging contests, they're on the collegiate side of things. We'll see a goat that's parrot mouth at times. So I would say about I guess 1 out of every 2 contests, we'll see one. Um, on the doe class, the one goat's obviously kind of the black-headed goat. Your 2 does kind of the blonde-headed doe. Your 4 does kind of a flighty eared, kind of a little bit of a cape fronted, doe, like even though it didn't kind of go past her shoulder. But that doe's ears were kind of really flighty, especially that right one. Let's see, that 3 goat was a very traditional kind of headed one. So let's see. The one question we got there in the chat is in terms of kind of breaking down your goat in terms of how they're set up from kind of a showmanship standpoint. On the livestock judging side of things, we don't ever, judge on showmanship. It's just more so the individual evaluation of that sole animal. So like on the goats, we never really talked about showmanship on them. As the does are loose, it doesn't matter. When the market goats are set up in the rack, it doesn't matter. So like that video on the market goats, they were initially braced. You don't ever really see that at a contest unless it's American Royal, or even kind of San Antonio. So outside of those big contests, but in terms of like showmanship though, I know we'll transition out of that judging aspect to the showmanship side. It's always important to make sure your goats are kind of set up correctly, that where those feet are at all times. The reason why base width is at times not the best indicator for muscle, and why upper hip width is more important, is because when we're showing those animals, as showmen, we want to show the flaws out of that animal. So if naturally, you know, you got an animal that's not that heavy muscled and could use more muscle, you're going to set those feet a little bit wider when you're, you know, kind of got your leg in front of that sheep or in front of that goat and you're trying to get a brace out of them. So you're going to try and naturally kind of fix them so they appear heavier muscle there when the judge gets in behind them. So that's why maybe at times their upper hip width is going to be more important than kind of their lower base width. So like in the ghost that we saw, that's why that chest view was so important, because instantly we were able to say, okay, 3 is just not good enough in terms of that chest view. And then also because we read that goat's upper hip being a bit narrower in that market goat class, we also were able to realize, okay, his legs are just set out a little bit more naturally further than he's probably built. So that's why he looks a little bit wider down low, but he's narrow pinned and kind of really plain sissy chested. So as showmen, though, it's important to kind of show those flaws out of your animal. In judging, you kind of take a little bit of that showman bias out of the equation. So I don't see any more questions kind of coming through, but that's kind of all I got so far.
Okay. Thank you, Matthew.
No
Appreciate
problem.
it. Anybody else? Appreciate it. Once again, we'll have this recorded and put on the websites. I think Mackenzie had shared the website there. Well, thank you. Everybody have a good evening.